The Candace Lee met an inglorious end when a 130-foot tall pine tree snapped off in a windstorm. I lived on a lake when the wind often picked up speed, covering the distance to my house at the end of the lake. On a windy day, the treetop in front of the house and 75 feet long of it first bent in the wind, then snapped and flew before landing in the woodpile, exploding it before crushing the skin boat. The boat had sat on the boundary between the rose garden and the woods in my yard for many years, collecting pine needles in its bottom and black mold on its skin. The rudder had oxidized and the seats had lost their varnish. A sad end to a craft that had given us an adventure worth remembering. The idea of the Folboat was to travel in a way that the Labrador Inuit had for thousands of years in fragile kayaks with a light framework of driftwood or whalebone that they covered with stretched skins and made waterproof with whale fat. The boat came in a long cardboard box filled with sticks of wood and fabric like that of old-fashioned oil tablecloths. Jeff and I, but mainly Jeff since he was a boat builder by trade, began to assemble the sticks in a summer cabin near Camden, Maine. I helped where I could. That summer Jeff met a girl who lived on an island off the coast, and Jeff took the boat pieces along with him when he moved to the island. The finished boat was to be a Folboat kayak, a non-folding 17.5-foot two-person skin boat constructed like an Inuit kayak. This type of craft was appealing since we were headed into northern waters, where such a boat had a prehistoric tradition of navigating on the oceans. The coast off of northern Labrador would seem to be made for wandering about in a skin boat, with its numerous islands, coves, and fjords. Here Labrador Inuit lived in relatively isolated coastal settlements, connected by a coastal steamer. The only roads are in small towns of 300 to 1,000 people. When the steamer docks, the community turned out, and children play by jumping from steamer to dock, braving the gap between and the 20-foot fall into the cold northern waters. It's a bit chaotic, to say the least, and best to step away from the people swirling and milling about. A few years prior to our trip, Jeff had built a Wayfarer dinghy from a kit and sailed it north with a friend, north of Nain, Labrador. His friend began having symptoms of illness and recognizing it for what it was, wanted to be dropped off at a fishing station where he could catch a boat for the trip back to civilization and treatment. With luck, they reversed course from sailing north to arrive at Black Island just as the boat was departing for Nain. His friend hopped aboard and headed to Nain, from which he was airlifted to a hospital in Goose Bay, Labrador, in treatment. Jeff, having both built the boat and quit his job for the trip, decided to continue north alone into the furthest reaches of Labrador, a land of ice and snow, deep fjords, and rock faces to climb. Having spent his formative years as a founding instructor for NOLS, the National Outdoor Leadership School, and climbing the forbidding north face of the Matterhorn at age 16, this was normal, if unusual, pastime, especially alone, far from civilization and other people. Jeff sailed north to the Tornat Mountains. Arriving there, a traveler is surrounded by a spectacular landscape of fjords, mountains, and rock faces, one of which Jeff climbed, going from an icy ocean to a towering 1,000-foot high rock wall. The trip north. Haven, Maine is a town on a rocky island that sits off the coast where residents sustain themselves by fishing, lobstering, and catering to summer tourists. On a sunny day, the scenery is almost beyond beauty. On a typical foggy day, there is no scenery, but often the clank, clank, clank of boat tackle against the mast of a small sailboat anchored in the harbor. Launch day. To get from Vinalhaven to the mainland at Rockland Harbor is usually accomplished either by ferry or small seagoing craft. For this trip, we would launch the Candace Lee, named for Jeff's girlfriend. The day was bright and sunny with little chops, short, steep, isolated waves that caused small craft a rougher and slightly unpredictable passage. As we passed White's Ledge and looked across the bay, the 16.2 miles of open water seemed a long way off. Normally, small craft hug the coast and do not venture across such open reaches of water. If only good weather and minimum chops would hold during our trip. Out in the middle of this long passage, the weather held. Power boaters slipping along were able to see us sitting low in the water, and chops remained low. Any real concern eased when we passed the Rockland Lighthouse and jetty that protected Rockland Harbor. Although with our tired arms, we were eagerly anticipating landing on shore. The next day was filled with shopping in the local grocery store, packing food in the bags that would fit into the kayak, and loading everything into the car. Bright and early the following morning, we started off the drive to Newfoundland. An impression that many residents have is that Maine is the easternmost point of the United States, and therefore the easternmost point of North America. How wrong is this impression? From Calais, Maine to St. John's, Newfoundland is a trip that exceeds 1,000 miles, a trip that we had just started. Starting out from my home in Unity, we began the drive passing through New Brunswick onto Nova Scotia and Cape Breton with the destination of the town of Sydney, and eventually North Sydney in the Atlantic time zone. In North Sydney, we pulled into a long line waiting to get on the ferry to Port aux Basques, Newfoundland. We had timed the trip for an evening crossing, which takes about 8.5 hours. So after parking the car on the ferry, we headed for the rear of the ferry to find a place to rest and maybe get some sleep. Our first call was Port aux Basques, a colorful town perched on a rock at the edge of the North Atlantic. But this is a jumping off place. You can start the long drive to St. John's, Newfoundland. But first, we needed to reset our watches forward 1.5 hours to Newfoundland Standard Time, where the sun comes up here long before it strikes Mount Cadillac in Maine. Port aux Basques. Leaving Port aux Basques and driving through endless northern forest, you eventually come to the town of Corner Brook. Somewhere near Corner Brook, Jeff and I were experiencing yellow line fever, a dangerous driving condition where the yellow line on the road gets blurry and your eyes keep closing. Finding a wide place beside the road, we pulled out our sleeping bags and got an hour of shut eye, even if it was not really sleep. Hitting the road again, we encountered Deer Lake, where coffee and gasoline were available. From here, you can head north to Gros Morne National Park, a land of fjords and the mystery of the Earth's plate tectonic subduction zones that I would like to visit at a future time. We, however, were still headed east to a turnoff from St. John's Road at Notre Dame Junction, a place of trees and swamp and a half cloverleaf junction in the road. We went north to Lewisport to take the coastal ferry to Labrador. Gros Morne National Park, Newfoundland, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Not only is the landscape breathtaking, but is one of the few places in the world to see where an ancient seafloor was scraped onto the surface of the land. It is available for visitors and scientists to see and study. For this reason, it commands worldwide attention. At Lewisport, Labrador, we caught a coastal steamer headed north to Goose Bay. From Goose Bay, we caught a rusty coastal ferry, since replaced, sailing north from here, stopping at each small town to drop off supplies and pick up passengers. Each stop saw most of the town come to the dock, standing or milling about, resulting in a routine pandemonium during our time at port. In the town of Rigolette, a town of 300 people, a good part of the town rushed to greet the steamer. Small boys jumped from the dock onto the ferry or from the ferry rail onto the dock, making the ferry part of their playtime. During one such jump, one boy slipped and fell 20 feet or so into the water, in the narrow opening between the ferry and the dock. Jeff, anticipating that one of the boys might slip, quickly snatched up a life ring and threw it to the boy in the water, then handed the end of the rope to adults, eager to pull the child from the water. This must have been a fairly normal event, since the life ring had a rope attached long enough to reach the water. Having done this, Jeff walked away from the madness that followed. We were on a journey to experience wilderness, not to be part of a crowd. When we arrived at Goose Bay, Labrador, we unloaded the Candace Lee onto the dock, with a pile of gear waiting for the next ferry north, an old rust bucket of a boat called the Bona Vista, to Nain, Labrador. While waiting, we met Eric, who we stayed with overnight on a return trip, as we had to wait a day for the ferry for the trip south. Eric became a friend, and in later years, he and I took a canoe trip to partially retrace a tragic canoe trip from Goose Bay area on the eastern shore of Labrador to Ungava Bay on the northern shore. In 1903, Leonidas Hubbard was commissioned by an outdoor magazine to explore Labrador by canoe. Joined by his best friend Dylan Wallace and a Scots Cree guide, George Elson, Hubbard hoped to make a name for himself as an adventurer, but plagued by poor judgment and bad luck, his party turned back and Hubbard died of starvation just 30 miles from camp. The story is written in an older book called Greatheart and more newer books. In Eric's and my canoe trip, we retraced the beginning of this journey to a point where the early explorers made their mistake. Paddling down the 35-mile-long Grand Lake to the supposed river opening, we spied an obvious channel which clearly was the stream that the ill-fated canoers took. All the while the desired channel was hidden behind heavily forested islands formed by sand washed down from the stream leading north. It was at this junction that their fate was sealed, and these early explorers were stalked by exhaustion, starvation, and even death. And after years, his widow returned to complete the journey he started. Later adventures connected this river to one in Quebec and then north to Ungava Bay at the northern end of North America. Jeff and I caught the ferry from Goose Bay to Nain, Labrador. And when the ferry arrived at Nain, the usual mass hysteria of adults and children flooded the dock. As quickly as possible, we put the Candace Lee in the water to paddle around the point of land to distance herself from the crowd and possible damage to the fragile skin boat. Paralleling the small airport runway, We rounded the point of land into Strathcona Run, where we found the winds and waves far too high to paddle the short distance ashore. Our only choice was to turn and run with the wind down the fjord. This passage was beyond exciting, as we encountered swells in the water higher than the kayak was long, so that we alternatively were at the bottom of a trough or at the crest of the swell. We could never see over one swell to the next, and Jeff, sitting in the rear seat, saw that at one point the top of the swell was above my head, sitting in the front of the kayak. Our speed down the center of the fjord would have been impressive to observe if we only had the luxury to look. This was a truly frightening experience for me, the one we did not have time to think about, as kayaks are most stable with paddles in the water, stroking as hard as possible. Spotting a channel at the edge of the fjord, about a mile ahead, we gradually steered candidly in that direction. My description of this journey is that of a Nantucket sleigh ride, used to describe a small boat being pulled along by a wounded harpooned whale during the early days of whaling off Nantucket. The Candace Lee, in our first rough water, behaved as a true Arctic craft, and the channel we were seeking came up quickly, taking us out of the maelstrom into calm waters. We rounded a small sand point and came to a protected beach on Hillsbury Island. On the beach, out of the wind, we pulled the craft ashore, next to a rock ring that may have held down an Inuit sealskin shelter from 100 or even 1,000 years earlier. The day after a Nantucket sleigh ride proved windy, with whitecaps in the water. Wave tops break away when the wind speed causes sufficient shearing, but needless to say, we were not going out on the water, but decided instead to explore the hilly island. Walking from the campsite uphill, we soon ascended the lichen-covered rock to overview Strathcona Run on the southern side and the channel to Dog Island on the northern side. These were still filled with white waves, as well as wave tops with the tops broken off and carried along by the wind. Afternoon was filled with reading, dozing, and talking. It was with trepidation that we launched candidly in the morning, to head round Dog Island, but the ocean was smooth as glass. Our progress on the water was swift, and before we knew, 5 miles or so had passed. We pulled in for lunch on a rock that sparkled in the sun. Nain, Labrador, and the surrounding area are known for a rock containing a blue to blue-green iridescent mineral, appropriately named labradorite. This mineral dotted the rock and sparkled in the sun. Later in the trip, one hot day that we encountered, I lied down on a shallow stream with pebbles of iridescent labradorite sparkling from underwater. As the day wore on, however, the wind kicked up and we put into a lee shore filled with boulders that made landing difficult. As we stumbled ashore carrying the kayak, a slip caused it to drop, breaking the steering part of the rudder. Later, Jeff fashioned a new part from driftwood and twine that lasted the entire trip, and indeed stayed on the craft for the rest of its life. Days were spent like this, sometimes ashore, while the wind howled and whitecaps played in the water, and other times paddling was as smooth as glass and we made distance quickly. During one enforced stop for a day or so, I read the entire collected works of Henry David Thoreau, and then reread this volume of over 100 pages before passing it to Jeff, who appeared happy to have it to overcome boredom. On our last day of our northward passage, We came to the northern end of South Olukstavik Island. Entering the channel there, we found a very hard paddle against the south wind that kicked up to take us to a lee shore with a good beach. After pitching our tent and making dinner, we settled in for the night, thinking about wind and water and hoping for calm seas. In the morning, we discovered that a small predator had been bitten through the skin of the Folboat, both ripping the skin and sinking its teeth into the wooded rib inside. Teeth marks sunk into the rib were a few inches wide, and the rip needed repairing. Jeff had brought spare canvas left over from building the craft and a bit of contact cement to effect the repair, so the boat was seaworthy again. The red patch against the white hull visibly stood out for our colorful craft. Years later, I would revisit the craft to see the teeth marks and patch as it sat in my yard in Maine. You remember that all that led up to this event. Casting off in the newly repaired craft, we headed to an inside passage that would take us back to Nain in a few days with good weather. The channel on the western side of the island was more sheltered than the more open ocean that we had paddled north on, but it turned out to have one particularly tricky section that with a mistake could have capsized the Candace Lee. Ahead we saw a narrow channel with a good current on it, and pulled into the western shore to more closely inspect it. The rock adjacent to the channel had gargantuan potholes, perhaps 20 feet wide and even deeper, carved into it by rocks trapped in a depression and being swirled around and around, producing an action similar to that of a northern pestle, that in this case wore the rock deeper and deeper to form a cylindrical hole 20 feet deep and at least as wide across. No modern current was likely to produce such a hole, and it appeared that these were ancient leftover from a melting glacier, roaring out through this channel. That should have been a warning about what we were about to encounter. Entering the channel, we encountered rough going where the current was attempting to push us backwards, while waves were breaking from behind us. I learned that this situation is called wind over tide, where waves are heading into the tide, causing the waves to pile up on each other and have a much shorter wavelength and be much choppier. In our small, light craft, retreating was not an option, as we were afraid the kayak would broach and capsize if we turned sideways to both current and waves. At what point we reached an equilibrium between forward progress and being pushed backward, where with the two of us paddling as hard as we could, we reached a forward speed that just balanced out the speed that the tide was pushing us backwards. This was the task of Cepheus, who in Greek mythology, after angering several gods and quoting Zeus, was sent to the underworld. In the underworld, Hades punished him by making him roll a rock uphill, only to watch it roll back down. So he needed to continuously start over and over and over in a never ending, onerous task. Like Cepheus, we paddled forward but stayed in one place again and again and again. This continued with burning arms from the effort. We lost track of time. 15 minutes, 30 minutes, or even 45 minutes passed as the tide ran out of the channel. At last the tide began to slack, and we slowly began to creep forward. After this devilish channel, the run back to Nain was uneventful, with calm water and pleasant paddling. Not wanting to stay in Nain for the 2 days, before the coastal ferry started its trip south, we paddled to Paul Island, a few miles away. Camping on Paul Island was an interesting experience. The ground was covered with lichen that normally would be saturated in water, but we found deep desiccation cracks through the lichen. It also turns out that the mineral labradorite that I did my academic thesis on was discovered here and named by Moravian missionaries in 1770 and used by regional Inuit for centuries before in ceremonial objects. Across the channel, we stared at large cliffs carved in the rock as ancient glaciers advanced down the channel. The most interesting thing that happened here, though, was cooking and fishing for cod. When we started the journey, the kayaks were stuffed with food, so much so that we set atop a pile of supplies in a manner that promised to unbalance the kayak. By the time we reached Paul Island, only remnants remained. As a treat, we fried up a kind of homemade donut in our remaining flour that we consumed with relish, but found unedible back home. The best meal was a cod chowder that Jeff whipped up the day after fishing. That is a story of fine cuisine while camping. On a blue sky day, we put the canvas lee in the water and paddled to the channel at the head of Paul Island. Jeff had brought along cod jigs to fish. Cod tends to spend their time a few feet off the bottom of the channel, so the fishing method is to lower the jig at a line and pull it up and down in a dance to attract the cod. In one attempt, I dropped the jig to the bottom and pulled up a sea cucumber, a holothurn, an ugly-looking creature that I promptly threw back, although I understand that gourmets consider them to make a good dish. The highlight of the fishing trip back at camp was the excellent cod chowder that Jeff made from the cod that we caught at the head of Paul Island. Our greatest surprise, however, included a bit of a startle when we were visited by a minke whale. The whale passed by in front of the craft, but curiosity overcome the creature, and it turned around and surprised us by diving and swimming a few feet under the canvas lee. The minke whale is about 23 to 25 foot long, just a little longer than the canvas lee at 17.5 feet, but outweighed the kayak by 4 to 5 tons. Standing up in the craft to better see the whale, I was so startled that I stumbled and almost completely fell into the water. If the whale had breached, it was rare for this kind of whale, but such events do happen. While under the canvas lee, we would have both been in the water. Presumably, we looked like a strange whale, and the minke whale wanted to check us out. As all trips do, this one came to an end, and after paddling back to Nain, we caught the ferry south to Goose Bay, Labrador. There we stayed with Eric, whom we had met earlier. Since we had an extra day, we participated in a war canoe practice for an upcoming race. Having toughened our paddling arms throughout the kayak trip around Nain, we hope the war canoe practice for an annual event equal its best previous training run. Saying farewell to new friends, we caught the ferry south to begin the 1,000-mile drive back to Maine. Memories sustain us until the next adventure.